thank you very much, Stefan, for your wonderful presentation. And originally, as it appears in the description of today's session, I was supposed to make a complementary presentation about mind from a more philosophical point of view. In fact, I had prepared a PowerPoint presentation on the mind-body problem, but I had lunch with Stefan and we decided that it would be better to have a comment, a dialogue on some of these ideas, because I think it's fascinating and it is a different approach. I myself must admit that from the philosophical point of view, I am much interested in more theoretical descriptions of the mind, which do not really fit into these models, and from the chemical point of view in the neurobiological processes. But of course there is a gap between the neurobiology and then these theories about whether eliminativism is the right theory of mind or whether emergentism. So that what is wonderful about your presentation, Stefan, is that obviously you are a psychiatrist, you have experience with people like antipsychologists like Professor Zucconi, so you know that these extreme polarized views of the mind, the philosopher who wants to have like a complete theory of mind, whether emergentist, dualist, and the neurobiologist like Dr. Ramon y Cajal at his time, who looks for, so to speak, the constituent elements of the brain. But there is a whole world out there which is how the mind really works, and that's what a psychiatrist can do. What I am going to do is to pose actually 7 questions. Of course, then let us feel free to answer them or just to foster the discussion with the audience. That from both the philosophical and the neurobiological point of view, if you could shed some light on them. Well, first of all, you started by saying that the brain, you are speaking about the mind, not about the brain. But I must confess that for me it is impossible not to say something about the brain. So at some point, I know that this is a very difficult philosophical and both and scientific problem, but would you commit yourself to any of the prevailing models, eliminativism, emergentism, neutral monism? So could you say something about this and whether there is a promising line of research, both philosophical, for instance, I'm thinking of Patricia Churchland and what she has done on neurophilosophy. Do you think that any of these theories is going to open new perspectives and to seek for truth? And then what elements, I think that most people here would not adhere to dualism. I know that there are many arguments against dualism, but nonetheless, we still need to speak in dualistic terms, so that even if almost no one wants to be dualistic, in many of our categories, when analyzing the mind-body problem and what mind is, we still need dualistic categories, and maybe because that's how reality is. So what elements of dualism can still be of importance for our analysis of mind? So that would be the first question, the relationship between brain and mind. And, well, I know that you didn't want to speak about the brain, but what is your suspicion about the relationship? Can we conceive of the mind, for instance, as a software that is injected into a hardware, which is the brain, or it has nothing to do with this? So I think what is the brain and what is the mind is still a necessary question. There was a professor, he's not right now here, but he said, of course, correlation does not mean causation. I totally agree. But when there is a very strong correlation, there is also legitimacy in thinking that there is some sort of causation. So that's my question. The second question, I found extremely interesting when you said that, of course, all these great eminent minds of psychology point to a common factor, which is that mind is still evolving. So we know that biological evolution is very slow. It's a very slow process, but it seems that mental evolution, in a sense, is accelerated. My question is, can we actually take control of the evolution of the mind? Or it is a totally impersonal process that is happening there, so we don't know anything, but our mind is evolving and we don't realize that it is evolving? Or can we do something? Can we actually take control of this evolution, or we are, like in biological evolution, we are just passive observers, or what, or of the wishes of nature? So my third question is actually related with this second question. I'm sure that in some other courses this topic has appeared, but this idea of human enhancement and the idea that actually some people think, I'm thinking of Bostrom and his the Institute for the Future of Humanity at Oxford, Savulescu, and so on, that we can actually take control of evolution in a positive way, and that we can enhance mental capacities so that that dream of Eva Mensch and Superman could actually be achieved without the potential dangers that many writers, poets, and philosophers had foreseen. What do you think about this? Then the fourth question. You have made a very interesting distinction, which I think that philosophically it's a very interesting distinction between truth and the coherence of our mental system, our conceptual system, to borrow Professor Bayes' terminology. In the history of philosophy, there are two famous philosophers who we could say that they made the mistake of confusing truth and coherence, which is Spinoza and Hegel. So for Hegel, you know the famous anecdote that someone asked Hegel, what about if reality does not match your philosophy? And he said, worse for reality. So that's, my philosophy must be true because the rational is the real and the real is the rational. So many times philosophers and maybe even scientists and natural scientists confuse truth with coherence, and coherence is what offers us comfortability in how our mind works. But mentally, from the point of view of psychology and developmental psychology and these techniques that you are cultivating, how can we actually detach ourselves from the illusion of coherence, which grants us security and comfortability, to go to truth, to the truth is out there, no? I mean, so what can we do, and what can psychology teach us? This is a very philosophical question. What is truth? No, quid est veritas, no, the famous question, and how to reach it. Then in my fifth question, so you spoke about imitation and mirror neurons. I must say that 1 month ago I had a chance of listening in person to Professor Rizzolatti. He came to Madrid. He's credited as the discoverer, at least one of the first discoverers of mirror neurons, and it is revolutionizing research about the origin of language and learning. So we are imitators. We are constantly imitating. But obviously creativity, on the one hand, it requires imitation. We have to learn. No one is Adam on Earth and doesn't need to learn. Even Einstein had to learn what physicists had discovered before him, and so on. But imitation many times is clearly a constraint for creativity. So how can we detach ourselves from this impulse, which seems like unconscious, neurobiological, to imitate? Because sometimes imitation can destroy creativity. My sixth question has to do with the System 1 and System 2 concept. I mean, as you expose it, and of course it is also in Kahneman, and many people here will have read it. So there seems that as Goethe said, that there are two souls living in myself. No, we have like a divided ego. But this seems to be confirmed by cognitive research, that we have two systems. But in a sense, it is dramatic. I mean, that we are divided. We are like a fragmented subject with two egos. So isn't there some sort of degree so that System 1 is not completely separated, like a unity that flows on its own, and System 2 is another unity that flows on its own? Are there degrees of, can they be mixed? Are there degrees of, maybe in this process you have 60% of System 1, 40% of System 2? If you can say something about this. And just to conclude, and because there are more panelists, and to conclude with this cascade of questions, I know. So the last one. In group conformity and risk aversion. I remember that the first time I was exposed to this idea of risk-seeking, risk aversion was by a Russian friend who was doing a PhD in economics, and I said, oh, this is true. I mean, I had never thought of this. It's true that we are risk-seeking in losses, risk-averse in gains, and so on, what Kahneman discovered. But of course, the research points to the fact that naturally human beings are risk-averse. So that very few people take the risk, for instance, to develop a new idea, or to fight for a new political movement, or to create a new great company, or to write a revolutionary book. Very few people. And most humans, what they do is to be free riders on the carriage of other people. And I mean, for instance, I'm thinking of this lady, Rosa Parks, this woman, the first woman who refused to sit in a bus for black people had to sit, I think it was at the end of the bus, and she said, no, I'm going to sit where white people are sitting. And thanks to her, of course to many other people, but she was like the first one, thanks to her courage, thanks for her risk-seeking, many other free riders have profited from all these events. So if risk aversion is so much embedded in our psychology, in how the mind works, what can we actually do to be more risk-seeking? Because risk-seeking is the key to creativity. Without taking risk, it is impossible to be creative. It is always very easy to just conform to what other people say, to exposing other people's ideas and theories, but some people must have had to take the risk, I'm thinking of Darwin, for instance, to propose an idea. And of course, then, as Thomas Kuhn described, the dynamics of ideas is that once they become institutionalized, then what is actually revolutionary is to get detached from those ideas. But how can we foster, from the techniques of cognitive science and psychology, this risk-seeking experience in humans? That would be my intervention.
I was happy you mentioned ego in your list, and the relation. My background, though I studied psychology, I'm coming at this from Sri Aurobindo, from Indian spiritual or metaphysical point of view, not from the view of current thought in psychology. The relationship between mind and ego is very complex and very subtle. And certainly mind as we know it, and the thinking mind that we use, is inseparable from ego. No matter what we do, we've got a conceptual framework. It's largely subconscious. The definitions we use, the conceptual, the connotations of the words and ideas and everything, we can't separate them from our own experience, our own culture and all. The phrase which you've all heard, cosmic consciousness, refers to a state in which you're still having mind, but mind without ego. Mind in which the personal perspective has been replaced by an impersonal perspective. And I don't mean impersonal in the sense that we're now good scientists and we're not giving in our prejudices. Impersonal in the sense we are not centered in our own being. We're more universal is the phrase. Second point which we don't normally think of and which has been of great meaning to me personally is that mind exists in many levels. Because we've got one brain, although the brain has its own levels, we tend to think of mind as one thing. And I'm not talking about this physically, because mind, as we've been talking about, it is not a physical thing. But the mind we use to think about material things, Sri Aurobindo calls it the physical mind. The mind we use to deal with objects, to deal with sensation, has different characteristics to it than the mind we use to understand our social interactions, our emotions, our sentiments, the things we do in life, and has different characteristics than the mind we use for pure ideas, for metaphysics, for mathematics, for pure abstract conceptions. And I have found it very helpful to distinguish these. If you don't worry about where they are or what they look like or how much they weigh, but if you think of them more like wavelengths of light on the spectrum, some of which are much more gross and some of which are much more subtle. And I find it a very helpful concept. Going back to something Martha said in her comments yesterday, just to distinguish, I'm going to talk about the upper levels of mind, but just to distinguish it, there's many ways to do it, but our thinking mind, we think through structures, we think through forms. When we want to say who we are, we talk about where we were educated, or how old we are, or how much we weigh, or who our parents were. We think in terms of forms. If we say, how was your life, we talk in terms of events. That particular characteristic of the thinking mind, that it thinks through thought forms, and only knows through thought forms, it's hard for us to imagine that we could know not through thought forms at all. Not even, let alone words, but not even through thought forms. It's clear if I know that if we know that we're here, or if I know that I'm happy, I don't need to think whether I'm happy in order to know it. So I just wanted to say, if we're talking about different levels of mind, some of them are more visceral. We know through our sensations. Some of them are the higher ones that Stefan listed the whole list up there, are different ways of knowing. It doesn't mean just different types of thought. It can be knowing without thought. In fact, traditionally, the first thing that we have to do if we want to go be above the thinking mind is to stop thinking. And there are various ways to do that. But the higher ways of knowing only come when we give up reliance on using thinking as our method of knowing. Stefan talked about System 1, and earlier today we talked, yesterday, about intuition. It's a big topic. I just wanted to make one distinction. For us, everything that's not logical becomes under System 1, because we don't understand how it happens. In the spiritual tradition, there's a distinction between instinct, which is a non-logical way of knowing. The cow goes near some water and decides not to drink it, and the bird eats a berry or doesn't eat a berry because it knows. It doesn't think, I wonder whether this is poisonous or not. It knows subconsciously this is what it should do or not do. And we have instinctive, habitual responses. For the System 1 above is the word that I'm accustomed to using for intuition, which is like instinct, a direct way of knowing. It's not a mental way of knowing, which it has to be formulated as a thought, though it may convert itself into a thought. And yesterday, I think it was Alberto who said that we have to confirm our intuitions with reason and other things. The moment we start to think about an intuition or formulate it as a thought, it's already not a pure intuition anymore. It's already something that has been converted into something else. And all the things I know about confirm your statement, that however pure the intuition may have been, the moment it comes into the mind and touches the personality and touches the conceptual framework we have, it gets colored by that perspective. I think the question of mind evolving is really very intriguing, and maybe we put the sense of mind as a question here. Kind of the overall conceptual framework of the course is that mind has evolved, is evolving, and my answer to your question would be the more conscious we are of that process, the more we participate in it. It's the first stage in human evolution where we consciously can participate in the evolution of our own consciousness. And then finally, I'm not going to try to answer it at all, but I like your question, Carlos, about monism and dualism. And I just wanted to make it a little more complex, because 15 or 16 years ago, we had a day-long meeting with Evo in South India, where we were discussing an alternative form of monism, which starts with consciousness and ends with matter, rather than starting with matter and ending with consciousness. And I fell in love with this fellow at that time, because after 5 hours of discussion as a pure physicist, he said, this view is as reasonable and rational and coherent as the view that prevails today. So I think maybe when you said monism, you have in mind a view. If there's monism, it can only be monism based on a matter. That's only an inference. It wasn't spelled out. But if there is a monism, then there's still a question as to what is that one on which from which everything comes.
I also appreciate that you give security. You have a very secure way of affirming things, and that's great, and it's reassuring. Unfortunately, I have more questions because I have some problems with what psychology and psychiatry, with their maths, and I agree 100%, Sometimes psychiatrists and psychologists forget that they are drawing maps, and that every map has some advantages but some danger. We have a terrible record of enormous suffering being perpetrated in the name of cure. We have enormous boomerang effect of iatrogenic, and also the scientific research show, I'm talking Niemeyer and Raskin, for example, but, I don't know, it was too far for me if you had mentioned among the important colleagues Thomas Sachs, even Illich, and Basaglia, that has shown how, with the goodwill, sometimes we do terrible mistakes. So, I think your statement that we have to consider always clear consciousness maps are not the territory. I think that's so important. And also, I want to say immediately, without maps, you cannot function. I mean, it's not that you throw away maps and then what you do. Although you mentioned also something that fascinated me, but as a person, not as a professional, which is the way of knowing, we have dealt with that other times, that mystics or poets sometimes have to grasp, a gestalt that speaks better than 100 books and convey emotionally a sense that is so deep, and I'm no mystic, but I'm fascinated, that they say St. John of the Cross, St. Catherine of Siena, Rumi, that actually is so profound the experience that you cannot speak about. Because the moment you speak about you reificate that. That, impressed me, and I think I know what it means, the term epiphany. I had very few times moments that are precious in my life, have affected me deeply, made me feel connected with the universe, so much to believe that it's not just a nice idea that we are stardust, and sometimes we reconnect with the whole universe. I'm feeling it right now, that I wish I could be more in touch with being part of the universe, and I think if I was more in touch with being part of the universe, I would be less dangerous. I would be less dangerous for myself. I would be less dangerous for my clients. I would be less dangerous for society and every other human being. Unfortunately, we experts on mental health are famous for not having better mental health than our clients. And people that are in the field that know that very well without needle research. We are famous for having been blind to the bias and the value of our maps. So much so to have damaged entire parts of the population. I'm not going to go again to the damage done to women and minority, but still we need maps. And nowadays, and I'm part of that fashion or trend, there is neuroscience. By the way, Silani, that is a well-known neuro researcher, was doing the doctorate, and now she's a part of the staff, with Jacoboni and Rizzolatti. And we invite in Italy, Cacioppo, Dux, Damasio, and all that. All these people are fascinating and give a great contribution. And what they tell you, especially at breakfast over coffee, we don't know anything really. We know what, maybe 0.5%. And they show us these nice slides that the brain is all dark and blip, by magic, some lights come up. That's totally false. Those slides are intentionally falsified, because if they show you the real thing, you would have 1 million things going on at the same time. And so they, like plaque on your teeth, your dentist give you a red colostory, then you spit and you see the plaque on your teeth. So the reality and the mapping, you're totally right, is totally another thing than reality. But we cannot approach reality. So what is my thing? I wish myself to keep always two interrogative points to every exclamative points I have. To keep humble and to know that the person in front of me, my client, is a human being and is not a schizophrenic, is not a borderline, is a human being with hope and fears. Also, I appreciate very much the deep research and work that Bowlby did in terms of attachment and to have a safe base or an insecure base. And the havoc that brings in people's life, I think, is a reliable map. But then, if this is true, let's be true, let's take notice of two things. That our maps are continuously declared obsolete by the same science, because it never would be final map. So to keep always an eye, again, to the social consequences of our map, to the power differential, that every different map has in different, because one thing is if I see the thing as everything can be seen as a reinforcement, a positive, negative reinforcement, but it has consequences to have that view. It brings a different politics. Also, if I see it as Freud, that we have an enormous destructive S or id, it's different than to see a Carl Roger that see that there are organismic potentiality that can be actualized if the conditions are favorable. Also, research. Well, for what I believe, I have tons of research. Some of that research I do myself, myself and with my colleagues. But again, you know, let's not be naive also about research, because often with research, question, that's the answer you get. And also what kind of research? There is quantitative research, there is qualitative research. So I agree fully with you that everything we do and think is a map. Let's make map explicit as such, and also the cost benefit of each map. I don't have the golden recipe, which map is good, nor any map is bad, but any map brings you in a different, little different direction. That's all I have to say.
Most of the questions you're asking are familiar to me, okay? In the sense that I've been dealing with these questions in a more or less daily basis, in the clinical setting, in the peer scientific setting, and I also do have, for me, answers to most of the questions. I do. Right? I'm not saying that this is the last answer, I'm not saying that it's an ultimate answer, but I do have answers to most of the questions. Let me start to summarize the questions because they're partly overlapping. Just consider the following. If your mind, if your consciousness is mainly organized around a pre-rational way of thinking, perceiving the outer and inner world. Some authors call it archaic or mythical or pre-rational, whatever. What do you think you would recommend these societies or these individuals to do in order to become more rational? You would probably recommend them to say, please use science. With the example of Newton, If you don't believe me, look through the telescope. If you don't look through the telescope, you will never understand the heliocentric and the world-centric view. Never. If you don't look through the telescope, if you don't follow a specific experimental procedure, if you don't follow a specific practice, you're never going to become rational or scientific about what I was saying. If you take that idea in order to answer your question, the question of how to transcend the ego, you can use the same question. So how can you transcend the ego state? Ego state doesn't mean that the ego evaporates, but it's put out of the center of your gravity. It's been embedded, ideally, typically in a cosmic consciousness, in an integral consciousness, in a holistic consciousness, where the ego is a part of it, but just a part, a small part. And if someone asks you, well, how can I kind of transform my consciousness from a personal, egocentric, critical, analytical, thoughtful, scientific, deductible, inductible, perspective mind towards a more holistic mind? What should I do? What would you answer? The mystics of the last 500 years in Europe and the mystics of India and China knew that. They would tell you in one word: meditate. Meditate every day. 1, 2, 3, 5 hours under specific techniques. If we had more time, I can show you the psychology of it. If you want to write a PhD at Rudolfo's Research Center or Alberto's Research Center in Rome, it will take you 5 years to accomplish a PhD in this field. And then you get a title, and then you're an expert in computing and bioengineering or in human psychology. It takes you 5 years to do something, experimentally, practically, vocationally. And the same is true from that shift from an ego state to a trans-ego state. It doesn't come with thinking. It doesn't come with reading a book. It comes with doing something in specific. And the mystics would say, meditate. It takes you 5 years. We have data, if I have more time, we have data showing that students who start doing mindfulness-based practices have already a change in the brain after 6 weeks. You can measure that. You don't need that as a practitioner, but if you have to prove a method how you can change your brain, even your brain, I'm not even talking about the mind, even your mind and your brain, you have to do something in specific. And one thing you can do, you can meditate. But just as well, if you want to write a PhD under Rudolfo, it takes you 5 years, it can take you at least 5 years. Longer, so 7 years under Rudolfo, it can take you 8 years, Rudolfo, okay? It can take you also 8 to 10 years of practice. There is this Malcolm rule saying you need 10,000 hours of practicing in order to become an expert. Just consider 10,000 hours of meditating. This is when you're there. I can more or less, it's hard to say, but I can more or less tell you if you do it 10,000 hours and more, you definitely perceive a change and transformation of consciousness. Definitely. So 1 hour, 3 hours a day, just count how many hours did you do already. So we've got to go 10,000 hours with a mentor, with someone guiding you. Just Rudolfo guides you through the experiment. Okay? Then you are in a scientific mind. If you want to go beyond the ego mind, you need a master or a mentor or a practice and a specific technique which helps to transform your mind. That's what you got to do. Okay? And there's dozens of techniques. All religions offer techniques. They're partly thousands of years old. And that they have, since 30, 40 years, partly very good empirical evidence that they change the brain and change the mind. This is a different lecture. Sorry. Okay? And second answer, and then I will finish. We can then discuss it at the coffee break or whatever. having an opinion about mind-brain, whether it's monistic in one way or monistic in the other way, whether it's perspective or whether it's dualistic or complementary or causal in one way or another, all these questions arising, the question arising is a question of the ego mind. It's not a bad question, okay? It's a relevant question, but it's a question which is the property of the ego mind. A mystic doesn't have that question anymore because he has a non-dual mind where the relative form and the absolute manifest are identical. This is not a question if you have a transpersonal state. So within an ego state, you can decide whether it's monistic one way or another. You can have a 100-year, 500-year, 1,000-year discussion whether it's causal, complementary, concretistic. You can discuss it what is more the mind causing the brain, you can have an endless discussion about it. Okay? You can have an endless discussion about what's first and what's next. If you look at this graph, the only thing I would say if it comes to mind and brain, the mind is something referring to the inner part all the way up to full mystical envisioning, and the brain is referring to something visible to the outside world. Whether you look at it right now when you look at my forehead, or if you take an MRI, it's always the outer part of something inner. This is the only answer I can give. And indeed, you need a map. The map is not the landscape. It's just like the card is not the menu. But if you have no map, you're definitely lost. And what's the endeavor for society? Having the right map. Then you don't get lost. And when you're talking about the mind within the Anthropocene, we damn need a very good map how the human mind is operating in order to get things together. And this is not a question of engineering. This is not a question of economics. I think this is the question of psychology.
So for universe, you said that lower states and the higher states are similar, but not the same. What's the difference?
The difference is that the higher states have gone through the validation of critical ego mind. That's the difference. That's the difference in one sentence. Transpersonal, transconventional, transrational states have identified, verified, legitimatized through the bottleneck of science and go beyond science. That's the difference. A pre-rational mind. In a pre-rational mind, the sun goes down, literally. Okay? In a rational mind, you can measure the relation between the earth and the sun and how they rotate with each other. In a transrational mind, you can transcend that. That's the difference.